Thank you, everyone, and now I will introduce our speakers. So Eric Shatosky is a Spring member based in Toronto, Jess Morgan is a Spring member based in Hamilton, and Samuel Tetelepta is a Spring member based in Toronto and an organizer with Justice for Workers. Before I hand it over to our speakers, I'll just explain a bit about how the meeting will work. So the speakers will go first for a total of 30 minutes. Then we will have questions and comments from the audience. The speakers will respond to your questions and comments at the end of their concluding remarks. If you'd like to speak, please raise your hand and I'll add you to the speakers list. I will be using an equity speakers list, which means I may not call on you in the sequence you raise your hands, but I'll try my best to prioritize Indigenous, Black, comrades of color, women, and first-time speakers. Questions and/or comments are welcome, but please try to keep your contributions to around 3 minutes, so this will allow more time for contributions during the discussion. Finally, we encourage you to post on social media throughout the conference to share your thoughts and experiences. So please use the hashtag RedOctober2025, and you can tag Spring on all platforms using @SpringMag.ca. So with that, over to the speakers.
I'm not too familiar with using a mic. Can everybody hear me good? Yeah? Okay, awesome. Thank you, Chair, and hello everyone, and thank you for coming to our session. As the title suggests, we're going to be breaking down Leon Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution in the context of the Russian Revolution of 1917, and providing context for that revolution, as well as discussing the relevance of the theory in other revolutions globally and in our modern times. The theory of permanent revolution is one of Leon Trotsky's great contributions to Marxist thought. Trotsky was a socialist theorist and Soviet leader in the Bolshevik Party. He wrote this theory in the context of the 1905 Russian Revolution, when he saw the revolutionary power of the working class, also known as the proletariat, and he expanded on the need for the proletariat to lead revolution. His theory emphasizes the decisive role of the working class in struggles for reforms. The idea the theory is predicated on is that a backward country like Russia that was autocratic and dependent on nobility and feudal land relations economically did not have to go through the same sequences to achieve socialist revolution as capitalist countries that had developed industrially did. In other words, Russia hadn't progressed industrially the way that other European countries had at the time, and Trotsky theorized that the proletariat, or the working class, could come into power sooner in less developed countries than in advanced countries. Most Marxists at the time believed that only advanced industrial countries could achieve socialist revolution, and Russian socialists in the Mensheviks, as well as the Bolsheviks, which were social democratic parties, believed that Russia would first achieve a bourgeois revolution that the social democrats should support in order to defend the interests of the worker and then struggle for reforms under the coming democracy. For context, Russia at the time had a very small and young working class and a majority peasant population that were more interested in individualistic land gains. So Lenin and the Bolshevik Party agreed on the bourgeois character of the coming revolution and thought it would not extend to the reforms necessary for the worker. They believed a bourgeois revolution would only strengthen the denomination of the bourgeoisie. The Bolsheviks differed fundamentally from the Mensheviks on the idea of an independent labor movement from the liberal bourgeoisie. Lenin called for a working class alliance with the peasants, envisioning a divided government after revolution between workers and peasantry, and only after this, when the liberal peasantry ceased to be revolutionary, would the working class or proletariat become a revolutionary opposition. While Trotsky also believed an agrarian revolution necessitated the alliance of the worker and the peasant, he differed on the idea of an independent peasant party. He believed the peasantry were too divided by class amongst themselves to align in a united front. Trotsky believed that a strong united working class versus a conservative liberal bourgeoisie would force the peasantry to back the revolutionary proletariat to achieve their demands. He also knew the revolution and installation of a workers' government could not last without the revolution winning outside of national borders. And these ideas culminated in his theory of permanent revolution, with 3 key points to be summarized. The first is the combined and uneven development of capitalism. The uneven development of capitalism holds that different capitalist economies develop at different rates, within and without national borders. This results in hybrid societies combining advanced and backward capitalist features, sometimes within a single economy. Trotsky's example of Russia was that it was a feudal society and ruled by an autocratic Tsarist government, but it could not ignore European development of capitalism. Capitalism pulls the globe into one combined mode of production, forcing less advanced countries to develop despite their unevenness. and this produced capitalist advancement in Russia alongside its maintenance of backward feudal relations. Because of this unevenness, Trotsky thought that the Russian bourgeoisie, or a late capitalist bourgeoisie, was incapable of providing a democratic revolutionary solution. It could not destroy feudalism or achieve national independence or democracy. It was an absolutely conservative force. The second point is that the revolutionary proletariat plays a key role in leading the revolution. He believed the peasantry would rally behind a strong working class united front, even if it was small and young. He essentially argued that socialism from below is key to revolutionary change. He believed because of this, the democratic revolution would grow immediately into the socialist revolution, thereby becoming a permanent revolution. And the third key point is that a completion of socialist revolution within national borders or in one state is impossible, or in his words, unthinkable. Socialism in one country would ultimately fail in the face of capitalist imperialist global forces. And as Tony Cliff put it in his 1963 Deflected Permanent Revolution, he said the Russian Revolution of 1917 proved all of Trotsky's assumptions to be right. So the backdrop for Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution is Russia 1905. He saw that despite being a small working class, they were leading strikes and halting the flow of profit and playing a crucial role in the revolution. In January of 1905, a peaceful demonstration was led by workers and their families to the Winter Palace in Petrograd, which is now called St. Petersburg, to present a petition to Tsar Nicholas II. There was dissatisfaction amongst workers and peasantry with the Tsar. Working conditions were terrible, and the peasantry had long been ready for feudal land relations to be abolished, as well as the resounding defeat of Russia in the Russo-Japanese War. The demonstration was met with harsh repression and firing on by imperial forces, killing and wounding hundreds. And this would be dubbed Bloody Sunday and spurred strikes and revolts among workers and peasants. This is when we see workers' councils with elected leaders or Soviets pop up, organizing from below. The Tsar established the Liberal State Duma, promising certain governmental rights to quell the dissatisfaction of the people. But this, however, was undermined when troops returned from the front lines of the Russo-Japanese War and violently repressed the revolution, reassuming power to the Tsar and effectively ending the revolution. Just 12 years later, in February of 1917, Russia is at war with Germany at the border, and many are starving, working conditions remain terrible, and dissatisfaction is at a peak. The Bolshevik Party at this point had thousands of followers, many of them factory workers, building the revolutionary confidence of the working class. However, the leaders of the Bolshevik Party remained in exile by necessity. On February 23, 1917, on International Women's Day, women textile workers striked in the streets of Petrograd, demanding bread and an end to the war. The movement grew into over half the city's workers striking and marching in the streets. The Tsar ordered the army to stop the insurrection, but many of the army members ended up revolting. Strikes and mutinies sparked across surrounding cities, and the revolution grew. Tsar Nicholas II abdicated on March 2nd, driven out by the power from below. But rather than a working class government taking power, a dual power government emerged to fill the vacuum. The Duma resumed their place as bourgeois politicians constituted by capitalist parties, and the other body was the Workers' Delegate Councils, the Soviets. The two main parties that won leadership in the Soviets were the Mensheviks and Social Revolutionaries, which were a party based in the middle class. And despite them having majority support, the Soviet leaders of those parties acquiesced power to the Liberal Duma, and they formed a provisional government. Many of the Duma officials had wanted reforms to the Tsar state, but certainly not to overthrow it. They supported continuing the war with Germany and expanding the imperialist power by taking on new territories. And they failed to meet any of the workers' demands that had spurred the revolution. Lenin arrived from exile in April and started to popularize the idea of a workers' government to the Bolsheviks. He argued that the provisional government was a capitalist government and the war was an imperialist war. Lenin, at this point, had come to the conclusion of Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution, that the proletariat was to lead a socialist revolution with the peasantry backing them. The Duma did not have the power that the workers had over the trains, the posts, the flow of profit, and they would be unable to stop a workers' revolution, especially if the Bolsheviks were to win over the National Guard. By October 1917, Prices had doubled, hunger had increased, and diseases were running through the towns. There was economic chaos, and the army was suffering from lack of inventory on the front lines as factories, mines, and railways seized up. The provisional government's capitalism was collapsing, and the Bolsheviks had been growing the confidence of the workers to seize power for themselves. So the people took to the streets again. The allegiance of large numbers of workers and the infantry to the Bolsheviks created a nearly bloodless revolution. Lenin, Trotsky, and the Bolsheviks did not seize power by a military coup. They built revolutionary confidence over time in the working class and strategically waited to take power. Ultimately, though, the workers' government collapsed due to the pressures of global capitalism and imperialism, proving the third assumption of Trotsky's theory. Russian bourgeoisie from the outset implemented harsh countermeasures, calling to capitalist countries to aid and forming the Russian White Armies. Russia was forced to build a mass military industrial machine in response to the might of global imperialism, and the Civil War resulted in many of the most revolutionary workers dying or getting injured on the front lines. Resources were drained, the revolutionary force was halved, and by 1918, hunger and cold had killed approximately 9 million Russians. The failure of revolutionary uprisings globally to realize themselves had left Russia isolated and at the whim of the capitalist class. So while the workers' government eventually ended, the time in which the Soviets formed government was an incredible win for socialism and instituted many progressive decrees in its short time. I'll now pass the mic to Eric to talk about the impacts of the Russian Revolution outside of the Soviet Union.
Thank you, Jess. I'm going to discuss the influence of Trotsky's permanent revolution following the Russian Revolution of 1917. To begin, though, I would just like to highlight a prominent historian who was a key figure in expanding Marxist thought outside of the imperial core, someone whose work really embodied decolonial Marxism and served as an integral introduction for me when it comes to understanding historical events through a radical lens. And this was Walter Rodney. He was a Guyanese Marxist historian and revolutionary activist who, like Trotsky, was actually assassinated as a result of his life's work, dying at the age of only 38. Before that, however, he wrote many books and academic works, one of which was called How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. His most famous work, that is a great introduction to historical materialism and applying a decolonial Marxist lens to the context of African development. Like Trotsky, Rodney knew that the worldwide system of capitalism had to be understood in terms of even and uneven developments. And with this, he emphasized that even and uneven are not simply comparative terms, but rather they have a dialectical relationship in that the two produce each other through interaction. They are relational. In this sense, the development of Europe formed as a part of the same dialectical process as Africa. The wealth transfer that resulted from the exploitation of African labor caused Europe to develop further in their capitalist development at the expense of Africa becoming underdeveloped or overexploited, as Michael Parenti likes to put it. Rodney, he also wrote about the Russian Revolution in his book, The Russian Revolution, A View from the Third World. In it, he does an excellent job of really dispelling the myths and assumptions that bourgeois and Western historians have perpetuated in relation to the intentions of the Bolsheviks. Where Rodney, he basically makes the case that the 1917 revolution must be understood through the lens of dialectical materialism. That is, that all change throughout history is dependent upon contradiction within things and between things. So where capitalist logic assumes that things will remain constant over time, such as the capitalist order, Marx argued that the ruling class evolves as a result of the contradiction between them and the working class. Just as you cannot have the development without underdevelopment, you cannot have the bourgeois without the proletariat. When it came to explaining the contradictions that led to the Russian Revolution, Rodney and other historians first note the tension that existed between the semi-feudalist and semi-capitalist states and the working class that existed in Russia at the time. There was also the contradiction between the Russian national interests and the interests of Western capitalists who had a lot of predominant influence in the country. And these contradictions, alongside the impact of the First World War, are ultimately what shaped the 1917 revolution. So Rodney, he also wrote about the theory of permanent revolution, calling it a historical fact where during both the revolution of 1905 and 1917, the workers took it upon their own initiative to challenge the Tsar's rule, driven by the guidance of contradiction and combined development towards the revolution. As Jess elaborated on, essential to Trotsky's theory was understanding the potential for revolution in less developed countries, in which he emphasized the decisive and transformative role the working class can have in struggles for democratic reforms. And it was actually China where Trotsky argued that permanent revolution was most applicable, a country that had not yet achieved a full bourgeois revolution, just like Russia. China in the 1920s was a country with an emerging Marxist movement inspired by both the success of the Russian Revolution and the rejection of traditions of the Chinese past, as well as dominant Western imperialist influence in China. One of the critical actions implemented by the Bolsheviks was, when they came into power, was the renunciation of Tsarist privileges in China in 1918. And with this rise in Marxism came a proliferation of workers' strikes in urban cities, demanding better working conditions, better working and living conditions, eventually culminating in the Communist Party of China increasing exponentially in supporters and members. It seemed the case to some that the working class of China shared similar circumstances to semi-feudalist, semi-capitalist Russia before the 1917 revolution. However, historians have made some key distinctions in relation to Trotsky's theorization that separated the Chinese working class from Russia's. China at the time was basically subdivided between several warlords and imperial powers who were crucial in determining political events, and they had the capacity to essentially repress union and worker movements to a larger extent. It was because of this that under Stalinism, in the 1920s, driven by the idea of socialism in one country, that Russia demanded the Chinese communists align themselves with the Kuomintang, or the KMT party, the capitalist bourgeois party at the time in China, aiming to achieve national unification through a bourgeois revolution. One reason for this was that the CCP members were to radicalize members of the KMT party to, quote, build the left, unite the center, and attack the right. And this ultimately led to an increased tension between the mass mobilizing activities of the CCP and the right wing of the Kuomintang. Now, Trotsky, being a proponent of permanent revolution, was against the CCP-KMT alliance, noting how he thought it would undermine the influence of the CCP and force them to conform to the capitalist interest of the Kuomintang. And he was eventually proved right when the Kuomintang began to feel frightened by the growing influence of socialist revolution that the CCP ignited. By 1927, around 15 million peasants in China had joined communist associations that threatened the land ownings of members in the Kuomintang army. But the CCP, taking orders under Stalin, were told to maintain the alliance by restricting the radicalism of the masses, and in the words of historian Maurice Meisner, to basically dampen the flames of revolution. So on one hand, you have the interests of the Kuomintang aiming for a nationalist bourgeois revolution, colliding with the growing desire for a social revolution led by the Chinese Communist Party, who were told to tone it down in pursuit of national unification. This contradiction ultimately reached a breaking point where, when the Kuomintang, led by Chiang Kai-shek, committed a counter-revolution in 1927 in Shanghai that nearly eliminated the Chinese Communist Party and forced the mass movement away from the city and into rural locations. So what you have here in the context of permanent revolution is the recognition that the capitalist class will support democratic demands up to a point, but only in so much as their power towards property relations and workplace exploitation is not challenged. In defending the power, the bourgeois or capitalists will try to stop the forward progress of the revolution at all costs, which is why Trotsky emphasizes that the only social class that could play the leading role was the working class. In the context of both Russia and China, it was the bourgeois who were counter-revolutionary and the industrial proletariat who were the revolutionary class. In the Soviet Communist Party under Stalin, there was contention by the united opposition over policy towards China. CCP members who were in Moscow at the time were supporters of Trotsky, and the argument boiled down to whether it was possible to transform the Kuomintang into a worker and peasant party from within. And this is the ultimate criticism that arises from Tony Cliff in his 1963 article in his term Deflected Permanent Revolution, where the lack of workers' influence is ultimately what deflected revolutions away from true worker emancipation. This was the case, as Cliff argues, in India, where most of the unions were led by people outside of the industry, which made them have significantly less power when it came to bargaining power with the states. A contrast to what certain writers have noted about the power of black-led labor unions in South Africa and their influence in the anti-apartheid movements, which is actually one of another talk this year at Red October. Deflected permanent revolution has also been used when certain ruling parties came into power following decolonization in Africa, who purported socialist rhetoric, but at the end reinforced capitalist relations. Walter Rodney was ultimately critical towards the nationalist regime in Tanzania, for instance, during the 1960s and 70s, stating that the party remained under the control of the petit bourgeois. And yeah, this is where I'll pass it over to Samuel, who will further elaborate on that, as well as the broader influence of permanent revolution in today's movements. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Jesse, for those excellent introductions. Hello, everybody. I've had too much coffee already, so if my voice is cracking up, please bear with me. So yeah, for my part, I will discuss the relevance of the theory of permanent revolution today, and more importantly, what do we do with it? How can we use it in our day-to-day practices? Because the theory of permanent revolution, like all Marxist theory, is not to explain the history or predict the trends, but to guide our action to change the world. So it has been 120 years since Trotsky developed the theory of permanent revolution. And since then, we have seen many bourgeois revolutions around the world. Many of them happened in the context of national liberation that Eric mentioned earlier. And we have seen then the capitalist system has triumphed all over the world. It has combined all the countries in the world into a single capitalist system. And yet we are seeing that the world is still uneven as ever. And like you said earlier, Eric, because of the uneven dialectical relationship. So we see countries achieve level of development that is so high, but we also see many countries that are like hurled back into back in time. For example, we're seeing what happened in Afghanistan because of like the imperial war, and in Syria, for example, right? So even though bourgeois revolution has triumphed, capitalism has triumphed, we are seeing many groups of oppressed nationalities and other identities are still fighting for their fundamental democratic rights, right? Including in advanced Western capitalist countries. And instead of like resolving land questions, we are seeing the growth of capitalism increasingly displace people from their traditional lands all over the world. And groups of national minorities are still fighting for their national liberation, many of which are against the ruling class of former colonies, the national bourgeoisie, right? So Trotsky was correct when he said that the bourgeois revolution to capitalism is unable to solve the fundamental questions of land, democracy, or national independence in a manner that satisfies the working class. And he said that the only solution for all those problems is for the working class to continue their struggles until they abolish capitalism or when the revolution becomes permanent. And he's right. He's right that the working class have been and will continue fighting. And so since the 1917 Russian Revolution, we have seen numerous mass workers' movements. For example, in Germany, 1918, 1919, in Spain, 1930s, France, 1968, Chile, Portugal, Iran, 1970s, Poland, 1980s, Indonesia, where I'm from, 1998, Egypt, and Bangladesh, more recently. And all of these movements, they are mass workers' movements. And they started with simple demands for higher wages, land reform, or minor democratic reforms. But As their movements got bigger, the small economic demands turned into bigger, more radical political demands that challenged the power of the state and the capitalist system. But unfortunately, despite their power and potential, all these movements have failed. I'm going to give a couple of examples. For instance, I'm picking France, revolution in France in May 1968 as an example, because this happened in an advanced capitalist country, which kind of prove what Trotsky said, that revolutionary movement can happen in the backward capitalist country, or in France capitalist country, right? So in France in 1968, 9 million workers, including a large section of immigrant workers, went on strike for better conditions and against the authoritarian rule of Charles de Gaulle. And as their movement grows, its participants become more confident and their demands become more radical. Workers went simply from striking to challenge the rule of capital rule of property by occupying their factories. They established action committees to manage the running of essential public services during the strike, and in one major city, the workers' committees actually effectively ran the city for a week. And for 4 days in the last week of May, there was an effective power vacuum in France. Unfortunately, the workers' movement at the time lacked decisive leaderships, and the gap was filled by reformist forces, particularly from French Communist Party and Socialist Party and their trade union affiliates. So these parties sought to capitalize on the leftward shift in public opinion and channel the movement towards parliamentary politics. And in the last week of May, when the movement was at its highest, the Communist Party published a headline in its newspaper that read, "The workers demand a popular government of democratic union with communist participation." Now, this demand was far from revolutionary. In fact, it was an opportunistic demand, right? So when in May 30th, President de Gaulle, in desperation, offered promises of wage increases and general election, those offers were enough for the communist and socialist parties to break the strike and push the workers back to work. And the election that happened later was massive defeats for the workers' movement, because the right-wing parties significantly increased their parliamentary representation, while the leftist parties, their representation fell over by half. There are few reasons to explain that, but one of them is because of the limits of the electoral system itself, right? Because the French electoral system, and electoral system here as well today, prevented some of the movement's most radical segments, namely the youth and migrant workers, to be able to participate. And that's like a lesson that workers cannot challenge the state power through electoral arena, because workers' power lies on their workplace, not in the ballot box. All right, the same dynamic happened in Chile in 1971-73, when workers and peasant movements, which began with demands for better wages and land reforms, became more radical as their movement got bigger and the class war became more intensified. At the height of the movement, the Chilean workers established independent workers' council called the Cordons to coordinate the resistance against the attacks of the right-wing capitalist class. And the Cordons, having successfully defeated several right-wing attacks, became more confident in their power and demanded control of production and replacement of the parliament with workers' assembly. Unfortunately, their government, their leftist government at the time, under the presidency of Salvador Allende, was really committed to electoral strategy. He believed that he can bring socialism to Chile through constitutional reforms. So he denounced the Cordons, and he called the army to stifle the workers' movement. And urged the workers to put trust in the Constitution. Now, this strategy tragically backfired because the army later launched a coup against the government, bombarded the president in his presidential palace, and then move on to murder thousands of militant workers and put an end to the workers' movement. So the examples that I just mentioned confirm what Trotsky alluded in the theory of permanent revolution, that workers' movements that start with small demands have the potential to become more radical as workers move into action and the movement grows. Small protests for higher wages, for better working conditions, or political demands such as to defund the police can quickly turn into more revolutionary demands for systemic change, workers' control of productions, and reorganization of society. But it's also, the theory of permanent revolution can also explain the reasons why those movements in France, in Chile, in Iran, in Egypt failed. It was because along the way, the working class lost the leadership of the movement to reformist forces, and you mentioned this earlier, the theory of permanent revolution, like one of the points is the working class have to lead the movement, right? But in the examples that I mentioned earlier, they lost their leadership to reformist forces. In all those cases, the reformist forces managed to take the driving seat of the workers' movement and drove it back within the framework of existing orders. And these reformist forces proposed to the workers strategies and tactics that ultimately lead to their defeat, either strategy of parliamentary election or through making compromise and alignment with the bourgeoisie. The failures of those movements also revealed the theoretical and practical weaknesses of socialist left, because in no case did a significant socialist organization can offer a credible alternative path to the path that were provided by the reformist forces. The genuine revolutionary organization either did not exist or were too small to be significant. This is another crucial point that Trotsky made in the theory of permanent revolution, which is the need for a revolutionary organization that is big enough to effectively challenge reformist forces and help workers to develop their struggle to the highest possible form. In the case of Russia in 1917, that revolutionary organization was known as the Bolsheviks. So I would argue that the concrete task for us socialists in Canada today is to build a genuine revolutionary organization. But the question now is like, what is a genuine revolutionary organization? After all, in the examples that I mentioned earlier, many of those reformist forces called themselves Communist Party, Socialist Party, right? And that sounded revolutionary. But then again, revolutionary organizations are not defined by their names. Otherwise, we have to agree with Pierre Poilievre when he said Nazi was a socialist, right? Revolutionary socialist organization is defined by its politics and how it implements the politics in practice. For us, I believe, we believe that it must have three pillars. One, it must be committed to socialist revolution. And by a socialist revolution, we mean a literal uprising of the working class, a mass movement, not through parliamentary election, not through trade union reformism, but through a mass movement from below that smashes the capitalist state. The second pillar is that revolutionary organization must be deeply rooted within the working class. This is because the revolution would be made by the working class and not the organization. The role of the organization is to build unity, to build capacity and the confidence of the working class to take their small struggles into bigger political struggles and ultimately into revolutionary struggles. And this can only be achieved when the revolutionary organization actively participates in the day-to-day struggles of the working class for minor reforms that will improve the worker's life. Now, the challenge for such revolutionary organization is to make sure that their participation in minor reforms ultimately support its ultimate objective, which is for revolution. Number three, the third pillar is revolutionary organization must be internationalist. This is precisely because socialist revolution only becomes permanent once it achieves the final victory of socialism in our entire planet. So if the revolution happened in Canada, it is our task as a socialist to spread it outside our borders. And if it happened in other countries, let's say India or Bangladesh, we don't know, then it is our task to make sure our ruling class won't interfere in their progress. And we cannot do that by politely asking our ruling class to please don't intervene, but we can do that by intensifying the revolutionary workers' movements in our country. So I'll end with this. We are in a turbulent, how much time do I have? All right, we are in a turbulent moment in history right now, right? We're in a moment of polycrisis. Workers around the world are struggling through cost of living crisis, housing crisis, crisis of inequality, all while confronting bigger, more existential crises, namely worsening climate crisis and permanent war. And at times like this, even after it feels like defeats after defeats, something can suddenly emerge that inspire people to fight back in mass. It is our role as socialists to help build this mass movement so that it can reach the highest form possible to permanent revolution. Now, to be effective, socialists must work together in a genuinely revolutionary organization. Like you said, the Russian Revolution in 1917 was successful because the Bolsheviks had, at that time, they had passionately built their organization during the counter-revolutionary period of 1905 to 1917. So when that spark came in February 1917, they already had thousands of members with collective political tradition deeply rooted within the working class of Russia. This is the type of revolutionary organization that we're trying to build in Spring here. And if you're not a Spring member yet, and you want to help us build this, you got the form right there. Just put your name, somebody will call you. Let's get this permanent revolution going.